Hello everyone and welcome to another MCAT ACE lecture. So this lecture is focusing on the excretory system, and more specifically we are going to talk about the role of the renal system in maintenance of homeostasis. We will discuss how urine is being formed and then discuss structure of the nephrons and how it can help regulate the urine concentration as well as volume. And then finally we will go over the other structures in the renal system that are required for storage and excretion of urine. And then as always we will conclude our video with some practice questions. Alright, so first let's start with discussing the role of kidneys in maintenance of homeostasis. So basically the renal system, or the other words for it is the kidneys, is filtering fluids from the bloodstream in order to eliminate toxins. So filtering fluid from blood in order to eliminate toxins, nitrogenous bases. These are being excreted as urea, uric acid, or creatine, and also excess ions will be secreted in the form of urine. The second important role of the kidneys is to help regulate blood volume and pressure. And this is being done by maintaining a proper balance of water and salts that are being either reabsorbed from renal tubules or are letting to be secreted in urine. So for instance, if the blood pressure and volume is too low, then the kidneys reabsorb more water and salts. On the other hand, if the blood pressure is too high, then the kidneys will let some more water to be excreted as urine. So it will let more diluted urine to get excreted, and it will also let more salts to get excreted so that the blood pressure and volume will drop. And then in addition to these roles, kidneys are also metabolizing vitamin D into its active form, and we all know that vitamin E is required for calcium absorption. And then the final role of the kidneys as an endocrine organ is that it will secrete erythropoietin, which will help to induce production of red blood cells. So there would be production of red blood cells. Now the next topic is how is urine being formed. So basically the amount of urine that is being formed is dependent on three different factors. So here I'm showing you a structure of the kidney. You can see that the outside portion of the kidney is called renal cortex, while the more deeper structures right here are called renal medulla. And then there is a vessel, renal artery, that will go inside these kidneys. It will get filtrated and then some of the blood will return. So basically here it's providing a system to filter excess water, sodium, other ions, sugar, waste products, everything through the kidney. And then the leftover blood will exit the kidneys via renal veins. And then finally this filtrate, once it goes through more processes of reabsorption and secretion, will get excreted via the ureters into the urinary bladder. So here I'm showing you a cross section of a nephron that shows a nephron starts with a glomerulus, and this is the part where the blood is entering from afferent arteriole of the kidney and is exiting via the efferent arteriole. And so the higher the pressure, the blood pressure here, the more water and other sugar and molecules will be entering the renal tubules as a filtrate. Once it happens, then the filtrate will start to go through. So that's the very first factor that we just described. But so much of this filtrate will get reabsorbed. In fact, most of it is getting reabsorbed in the very first part that is called proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so now the the amount of filtrate that has entered the tubules decreases. And then at the same time, from the surrounding capillaries that are surrounding the tubules, some of the other waste products can get secreted into the tubules. So therefore now tubular secretion will add more volume to the urine filtrate. Okay, so that's why we say volume of urine depends on how much glomerular filtration we have plus how much tubular secretion we have. But then so much of this urine filtrate, which contains water, sugar, and salts, will get reabsorbed. So glomerular filtration plus tubular secretion minus tubular reabsorption is giving us the volume of urine. So let me give you an example. Let's just talk about water. Let's say that in 1 minute, 100 ml, just for argument's sake, 100 ml of fluid is being filtrated through the glomerulus. Now, as the fluid is going through, another 20 ml of fluids or other stuff is getting secreted into the filtrate. But then while it's going through, also a lot of this water and filtrate is getting reabsorbed. So let's say 80 ml is getting reabsorbed. So therefore, the final volume of urine that will exit collecting ducts would be 40 ml. So that was just one rough example to give you an idea how the volume of urine is a balance between the filtration, secretion, and reabsorption. And so let me stress one more time that secretion is from compounds that are found in the capillaries that are surrounding the tubules and get secreted inside the tubules, versus reabsorption is by reabsorbing the contents of filtrate into interstitial space, and then from here on these reabsorbed molecules will get reabsorbed again into peritubular capillaries. So peritubular capillaries are required for the reabsorption as well as the secretion process. Okay, now the question is, we just discussed glomerular filtration, secretion, and reabsorption. The question is, what factors affect the rate of glomerular filtration? And the answer is that it depends how much pressure is inside the vessels, and that pressure will push fluid out. So this is called hydrostatic pressure, which is basically the other term for the glomerular blood pressure, and it's shown right here. So this is P, so P stands for hydrostatic pressure, while pi stand for oncotic pressure. And I will go into a little more detail about what each of these means. So basically, hydrostatic pressure is the physical force that is pushing the fluid through. So what determines the filtration rate is the hydrostatic pressure of the blood inside the vessels, and then what pushes back is the hydrostatic pressure of fluid that is in the Bowman capsule. So the first factor is P of capillary minus P of tissue, or we can be more specific and say Bowman capsule. Okay, so that would comprise the hydrostatic pressure of what is inside the capillaries minus what is inside the Bowman's capsule. And so here, PC minus P of Bowman. And then the next factor is pi, which is oncotic pressure. And basically, oncotic pressure is the osmolarity that is contributed to the albumin and other proteins that are present inside the either the tissue or the vessel. And what this oncotic / osmotic pressure does is that it pulls fluid back. So you know how hydrostatic pressure likes to push fluid out? Oncotic pressure likes to pull fluid inside. Okay, so therefore pi of the capillary is trying to prevent filtration, while pi of the Bowman's capsule, this one is also having some osmotic pressure, is trying to pull towards themselves. So the other way of putting it is that oncotic pressure is a pulling force, while hydrostatic pressure is a pushing force. Okay, so putting all these things together, we will come to this final formula, that tells us net filtration is hydrostatic pressure inside the capillaries minus hydrostatic pressure inside tissues, and then this whole value minus pi of the capillary minus pi of the tissue or the Bowman's capsule. Again, you don't really need to memorize this formula that I've shown you here. It's more understanding of what hydrostatic pressure does. It pushes fluid out, versus what oncotic pressure does. The oncotic pressure pulls fluid towards itself. Okay? Now let's talk about factors that can affect this hydrostatic or oncotic pressure, as a consequence of which the filtration rate can be affected. Alright, so first let's go over intrinsic factor. Basically, intrinsic factor include, for instance, myogenic mechanisms, which reflects the tendency of the smooth muscles in the vessel to contract when they are stretched. And so therefore, once blood pressure increases, the afferent arteriole contracts to prevent excess filtration. Okay, so once the blood pressure increases, the afferent arteriole contracts to prevent too much fluid from getting lost here. Versus when the blood pressure drops, that's the time that the afferent arteriole dilate to raise the glomerular hydrostatic pressure to allow still some filtrate to go through and let the kidneys do their job. All right, so the very first mechanism was the myogenic reflex. And then the second mechanism is tubuloglomerular feedback mechanism, where there are cells that are called macula densa, and these are found at the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And these specialized cells will sense elevation in the salt concentration of the filtrate. So they would sense salt concentration within the filtrate, and consequently release chemicals that will constrict the afferent arteriole. So therefore, by constricting the afferent arteriole, there would be reduced blood flow, and consequently there would be decreased volume of filtrate that would enter the kidneys. Now, you may ask, so why did we do all that? What's the purpose of it? Well, by reducing the amount of filtrate that now enters the renal tubules, the whole flow of urine has been reduced, and therefore kidney has more time now to reabsorb the salt that is inside the filtrate. Okay, so let's explain this mechanism one more time. The tubuloglomerular apparatus, it depends on the macula densa cells, which sense the amount of salt within the filtrate. If there is too much salt within the filtrate, then the renal system knows that I need to reabsorb the salt. You're losing too much salt. So what it does is that it will constrict the afferent arteriole so that less filtrate will now enter the nephrons. And so there would be decreased flow of filtrate, as a consequence of which there would be more time for the kidney to reabsorb all the salt. Now, there are also extrinsic mechanisms. And these extrinsic mechanisms depend on the sympathetic nervous system, the other name for which is the fight or flight response. And what the system does is that it causes constriction of the afferent arteriole, as a consequence of which there would be shunting of blood towards more vital organs. I cannot really comment on how the amount of filtrate production will be affected. Generally, SNS could increase the filtrate production, and the reason for that is that even though there is constriction of afferent arteriole, SNS increases blood pressure. So one factor decreases filtration, the other factor increases. There's too much interaction. But if you've noticed, once you're under stress and your SNS system kicks in, that's the time that you feel there is more urge to go to the bathroom and urinate. And that's usually because SNS increases blood pressure. but then at the same time, by constricting the afferent arteriole, it lets more blood to shunt to other vital organs, like for instance muscle, in order to be ready to either fight or flight, depending on the situation. And then the second extrinsic mechanism is via the baroreceptors that are located in the juxtaglomerular cells of the afferent arteriole. And the job of these cells is to detect a decrease in stretch, in other words, detect a decrease in pressure of blood, as a consequence of which it will release renin. And so here I've shown you an image of what happens once renin is released. Renin helps convert angiotensin, which has been secreted by the liver. Renin converts angiotensin to angiotensin 1. And then later on, angiotensin 1 converts to its active form, which is angiotensin 2. And now angiotensin 2 does multiple functions. One, it will cause vasoconstriction of vessels, as a consequence of which blood pressure increases. It will also induce secretion of aldosterone from adrenal cortex, which increases the sodium reabsorption. And since water follows sodium, there would be increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. And then finally, angiotensin 2 activates secretion of antidiuretic hormone from posterior pituitary gland in order to increase blood volume. And this hormone acts on collecting ducts in order to increase the number of aquaporin channels so that more water could get reabsorbed. So just recall, the baroreceptors has responded to low stretch, or in other words, low blood pressure, as a consequence of which once renin was secreted and angiotensin 2 has got activated, now there is increased blood pressure by vasoconstriction, there is increased blood pressure due to increased sodium absorption, and since water follows, blood volume increases, and consequently again blood pressure increases. And then again there would be increased blood pressure by antidiuretic hormone, since more water gets reabsorbed from filtrate, and so blood volume increases. So all these mechanisms from renin lead to increased blood volume as well as increased blood pressure. Okay, so we've just finished the very first mechanism, which was filtration. So here we just discussed filtration and different mechanisms that affect filtration. The next two topics we are going to discuss is tubular secretion and then tubular reabsorption. All right, so the next topic is tubular reabsorption, and this is actually, pick a different color, there we go. This is actually the process through which substances from filtrate are getting reabsorbed within the interstitial fluid. And then from there on, it will enter the peritubular capillaries. So here we have substances from filtrate gets reabsorbed into interstitial fluid and space, and from here on, these compounds or substances will enter the peritubular, by peritubular means surrounding tubules, capillaries. And most of the reabsorption process, in fact 60% of the reabsorption that happens in the nephrons happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. So proximal convoluted tubule, as much as 60% of reabsorption happens. And the compounds that are getting reabsorbed here include glucose, water, other ions, as well as organic compounds. Then we have the descending loop of Henle that reabsorbs water only. And then we have the ascending loop of Henle that reabsorbs sodium, chloride, and potassium. Next, we get to the distal convoluted tubule that reabsorbs water, calcium, and sodium chloride. And then finally, we get to the collecting ducts that reabsorbs water and urea. And the more antidiuretic hormone is secreted, the more water will get reabsorbed because more aquaporin channels will get incorporated. Now let me ask you a question. We mentioned that aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption. Where does on these renal tubules the aldosterone act on? And the answer is on the distal convoluted tubule and part of the collecting duct. So here is where aldosterone will work on. Now the next question is, we mentioned that there is calcium reabsorption here. Can you tell me what hormone is acting on this region of the distal convoluted tubule to reabsorb calcium? And the answer is the parathyroid hormone. Okay, so let's one more time quickly summarize all the findings I just described for you. So we have the filtrate that is getting reabsorbed. 60% of the filtrate is getting reabsorbed from proximal convoluted tubules, and these reabsorbed compounds include glucose, water, ions, as well as organic compounds. The descending loop of Henle, so this structure is called loop of Henle, and it has a descending limb, a hairpin, and an ascending limb. So the descending limb is reabsorbing only water, while the ascending limb is reabsorbing sodium, chloride, and potassium. Then we get to the distal convoluted tubule right here, where aldosterone induces reabsorption of sodium, while parathyroid hormone, so aldosterone, while parathyroid hormone induces reabsorption of calcium. And then finally we have the collecting duct, which reabsorbs urea and water. An antidiuretic hormone acts on this segment in order to increase the number of aquaporins for enhanced reabsorption of water. Okay, so now we are done with the reabsorption component. The last component is tubular secretion, which is a process through which substances such as creatine, potassium, ammonia, and the rest of the stuff that we don't want in our peritubular capillaries are getting transported into the renal tubule. Okay, so here compounds move from peritubular capillaries into renal tubules, and mostly it's actually in the proximal convoluted tubule. So now let's discuss the compounds that are being moved there. So number one is mostly toxins, or for instance drugs that needs to be excreted and get rid of inside the blood. These are tightly bound to the plasma protein and therefore cannot get filtrated in the glomerulus, and so therefore toxins and other drugs that cannot get filtrated through the glomerulus has to be secreted by tubular secretion. Then we have the nitrogenous waste, like for instance urea and uric acid, which are being passively, some of them are being reabsorbed from filtrate, but then there would be again tubular secretion to push them back inside the tubule and get excreted. Then we have the aldosterone hormone. We just discussed how inside the distal convoluted tubule it increases sodium reabsorption, but at the same time it induces secretion of potassium. So potassium will enter the filtrate while sodium gets reabsorbed. Consequently, the sodium concentration of blood increases, but potassium concentration of blood decreases from secretion of aldosterone, because now potassium is getting excreted inside the urine. And then finally, tubular secretion also plays a role in maintaining blood pH. And for example, let's say that we have a condition where our blood has become too acidic, so the pH has dropped. Under these circumstances, so let's say the blood pH is too low. Under these circumstances, the kidneys will increase H+ secretion and increases reabsorption of bicarbonate, as a consequence of which the result is increase in blood pH. And then another scenario is, let's say that we have a high blood pH. Under these circumstances, instead of reabsorbing HCO3 negative, kidneys will reabsorb chloride instead. So chloride is reabsorbed. And then bicarbonate, HCO3 negative, is allowed to get excreted in the urine. So it will get excreted. Now since we've lost bicarbonate, blood pH will drop. Okay, so the result is a drop in blood pH. Okay, so now we are done with the discussion of glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. The next question that remains is that how does kidney regulate this urine concentration and volume? We just discussed how different filtrates are getting reabsorbed and so on, but what is the mechanism? How can it determine how concentrated urine is and how much volume to get excreted? And this is actually being done by a mechanism called countercurrent multiplication. Okay? And this mechanism is being done with the help of the loop of Henle. So here, let's show you that we have the loop of Henle here. And the filtrate concentration that enters the proximal convoluted tubule is about 300 milliosmolar. And this osmolarity, even though the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs 60% of filtrate, this osmolarity remains the same because there would be the same proportion of salts and other compounds as well as water that is getting reabsorbed. So let's say that we have a brand new nephron and now the filtrate is entering the loop of Henle. Okay, I'm trying to describe how a countercurrent multiplication is being developed here. So since there is 300 milliosmolar concentration in the proximal convoluted tubule and there is proportional reabsorption of solutes as well as water, therefore there would be 300 milliosmolar that also enters the loop of Henle. Now we discussed earlier that the descending loop of Henle is only reabsorbing water while the ascending loop of Henle is only reabsorbing salts. So what happens when the ascending loop is only reabsorbing salts? Consequently, the osmolarity of the interstitial space here will keep rising. So now we have 400. And by increasing this osmolarity, here there would be more water absorption. Remember, the descending will absorb water while the ascending will absorb salts. So now that osmolarity has been increasing, now there would be more tendency to reabsorb fluid from the filtrate that is in the descending limb. So now this osmolarity will change to 400. Okay? And then next, this 400 milliosmolar fluid will enter the ascending limb. Now what happens in the next step? The new filtrate is saltier than before. So now the ascending limb will continue to reabsorb some more salt. Consequently, the interstitial osmolarity keeps rising. It's now 500. And now that it's 500, therefore more water can get reabsorbed from here. So now more water gets reabsorbed and this one changes to 500. So let me pick a different color, to 500 milliosmolar. So now the next fluid that enters here is 500. So this fluid is 500 milliosmolar saltier. So now more salt can again get reabsorbed. So the next value would be 600. And so on. So there would be countercurrent multiplication, and by that it's called countercurrent because the flow of fluid in one of the tubules is downward and in the other one is the opposite way, it's upward. So they are in opposite direction. That's why we call it countercurrent. And the reason we call it multiplication is that the osmolarity keeps on increasing, or in other words, it keeps on multiplying. Okay, so this process will continue to go on until the osmolarity of the interstitial space at the deep medulla reaches 1200 milliosmolar. Okay, so now we have an increasing gradient. As we are going higher in the cortex, there would be less osmolarity here. So 300 up there, close to proximal tubule. As you go deeper, we reach very high concentration. Okay, 1200 milliosmolar. Okay, so here I'm referring for 300, this area shown in red, and 1200 milliosmolar for the other area in deep medulla that is shown in red. Okay, and so now the next question is, what's the significance of creating this medullary osmotic gradient? And the answer is that the kidney now has the ability to concentrate urine, either let it be dilute or concentrated. And how does that happen? So we just discussed that the posterior pituitary gland secretes a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, the job of which is to incorporate aquaporins in the collecting ducts. And aquaporins are water channels. So if there is too much aquaporin here, now there is increased permeability of the collecting ducts to water. And since the surrounding interstitial space has high osmolarity, a lot of water will get reabsorbed until the osmolarity of urine reaches 1200 milliosmolar. So that's the mechanism to increase the osmolarity, and so therefore it would be concentrated urine. Now let's say that there are circumstances where we drank too much water and our blood pressure is increased. Now the kidney wants to get rid of excess water, doesn't want concentrated urine. So under these circumstances, it decreases secretion of antidiuretic hormone, as a consequence of which there won't be many aquaporins. So water will not get reabsorbed anymore, and what will be excreted would be a dilute urine. So once again, purpose of the countercurrent multiplier, as I've just shown it here, was to increase osmolarity of medulla. Once that happened, now the antidiuretic hormone has the ability to increase water reabsorption by incorporating aquaporins. If we don't want to increase water reabsorption, then we don't secrete antidiuretic hormone. Okay, and then the last point I would like to mention in this image is that the numbers that are shown right here, this is the filtrate osmolarity, not the interstitial osmolarity, but rather the filtrate osmolarity. So we just discussed how filtrate has 300 milliosmolar concentration in the proximal convoluted tubule, and it will maintain that osmolarity. Once it reaches the descending loop of Henle, only water is getting reabsorbed, as a consequence of which osmolarity keep on increasing until it reaches 1200 milliosmolar. Now from this point on, as the filtrate reaches the ascending limb, all that is being absorbed is salts. And so since salts is getting reabsorbed, the filtrate concentration will keep on dropping. And so by the time it reaches the distal convoluted tubules, the filtrate has the lowest osmolarity. Now from here on again, it all depends on whether antidiuretic hormone is secreted or not. If it's not secreted, then dilute urine will get excreted. If there is too much ADH that is secreted, then too much water will get reabsorbed, and consequently we will reach a high osmolarity of urine, or in other words, we will excrete concentrated urine. Okay, next I would like to go over the other accessory structures that help with the kidney to function. So once all these urine products are entering the collecting ducts, the collecting ducts will all unite together to join the ureter. And ureter is a slender tube that conveys urine from kidney all the way to the bladder. So we had the kidney, we just discussed how urine has been formed, and from here on, ureter will bring fluids all the way to the bladder. And so here I've shown you the urinary system in females versus males. So more or less very similar structure, except that the urinary tract, the urethra, is longer in males than in females. And I will tell you later on what's the significance of that difference. So anyway, urine now enters the bladder. Now what is bladder? Bladder is basically a smooth sac that has layers of smooth muscles called detrusor muscle. And normally when bladder is empty, it will collapse on itself and form folds. But once urine starts to build up, these folds will disappear and bladder will expand. Once the volume of bladder keeps on increasing, that's the time that the parasympathetic nervous system, so parasympathetic nervous system will act on the detrusor muscle in order to help it contract. So it induces contraction of the detrusor muscle, and that's the time that we feel, oh, we need to go to the bathroom, like I've got too much urine in my bladder. But then there is urethra that is connected to the outside world. There is this skeletal muscle in the urethra that acts as a doorway to urine passage. So this skeletal muscle is now under voluntary control, and thus urination is generally inhibited until it's released by the conscious control. Now I've just told you how urethra in female is shorter than in males. So can you tell me what would be the significance of this difference? So because of this difference in size, bacteria can enter the bladder easier in females than in males. In males, there is a long path to go. By the time they are maybe halfway through, that's the time that there would be another urination and all this bacteria will be pushed out. Versus in female, they need less time before they reach the bladder and cause urinary tract infection. So that's why that females, in comparison to males, are more prone to developing urinary tract infection. All right, so basically that's about it regarding the discussion of the renal system. Next, I would like to go over some practice questions. I'm going to read these questions for you. At the end, if you need more time, then you can go ahead and pause the video. When you're ready, you can restart it and you will hear my answers to every question. So the first question, where in the nephron most of the water gets reabsorbed? Second question, which of the following is the site of the action of vasopressin? Third question, which of the following renal segments has the lowest urine osmolarity? Next question, which of the following mechanisms attribute to increased urine production during stressful condition? And then the final question, a male patient suffers from enlarged prostate that interferes with urination. Which of the following situations applies to this patient? Okay, so if you need more time, you can go ahead and pause the video. Otherwise, let's start with the first question. So where in the nephron most of the water gets reabsorbed? Well, we already discussed about 60% of water and filtrate and glucose and other molecules are getting reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. And so choice C would be the correct answer. Sometimes examiners try to confuse you. They say in a patient that has too much antidiuretic hormone secretion, where does most water get reabsorbed? And the answer is still proximal convoluted tubule, because 60%, even the entire other segments combined, will not be as much as the proximal convoluted tubule. So the answer still will be proximal convoluted tubule. What happens then to the collecting ducts? Sure, there would be now more water reabsorption. So let's say it was before 10%. Now that the ADH is secreted, it would increase to 30% of total water. But still, it won't be as much as what is reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following is the site of the action of vasopressin? So we've already discussed it. Vasopressin is acting on the collecting duct. So collecting duct is the answer. Versus the parathyroid hormone and aldosterone that are acting on the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so the site of action of vasopressin is collecting duct. Which of the following renal segments has the lowest urine osmolarity? So let's go over that question one more time. We mentioned that the filtrate has 300 milliosmolar concentration and it remains the same in the proximal convoluted tubule because there is a proportional reabsorption of solutes and water. By the time it reaches the descending limb of the loop of Henle, there is only water that is reabsorbed. So osmolarity will keep on increasing up to 1200 at the hairpin. And then in the ascending limb, there is only salts that is getting reabsorbed. So the filtrate osmolarity keep on dropping as low as 100. And then from this point on, the osmolarity can keep increasing depending on how much ADH is being secreted. So the correct answer would be the lowest osmolarity is in the distal convoluted tubule. Next question is, which of the following mechanisms attribute to increased urine production during stressful condition? So what happens during stressful condition? Sympathetic nervous system gets activated. There is high blood pressure, as a consequence of which there is now increased filtration, or in other words, increased glomerular filtration. And now from here on, there would be increased urine production. So let's see which of these questions, which of these answer choices meets this explanation criteria. So hypertension induced increase in glomerular filtration rate, that is correct. Next, hypertension reduction in reabsorption of water. No, hypertension doesn't really affect reabsorption or secretion, so that's not correct. And then hypotension, again, that is incorrect because stressful conditions will cause hypertension, not hypotension. Remember, sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight response. It increases blood pressure, it increases heart rate, it dilates our pupil because this system is preparing us for a stressful condition. We are ready to either fight or flight. So that's why SNS is called fight or flight response. And then the last question is, a male patient suffers from enlarged prostate that interferes with urination. So prostate is actually surrounding the urethra. If the prostate enlarges, it constricts the urethra, and that's how it interferes with urination. So the question is, which of the following situation now applies to this patient? Okay? So if we have the prostate here that is enlarging, what happens? Hydrostatic pressure keeps on building up in the bladder, in the urethra, and it will eventually affect the kidneys. So now because of too much hydrostatic pressure buildup in the Bowman's capsule, there will be difficulty for blood hydrostatic pressure to push fluids into kidneys, as a consequence of which there would be decreased urine production. So actually I have an image here for you to see. So by having now too much pressure in the Bowman's capsule, because now too much urine has built up, it interferes from any fluid to be pushed through the Bowman's capsule. So therefore there would be reduced urine production. So the answer is, which of the following happens? Choice A and B so far are correct. There would be decreased urine production, and then from here on it should be due to increased capsular hydrostatic pressure. So choice A is the correct answer. Choice B, due to increased blood pressure? No. And then choice C and D are incorrect because there is reduction in urine production owing to the mechanism that I just described for you. Okay, so once again, this was the equation that I described for you, and here what had happened was that the Bowman's capsule hydrostatic pressure increased. Okay, and so if Bowman's hydrostatic pressure increases, the net filtration decreases because it has a minus sign right here. So that would be the end of this lecture. That concludes our discussion. Thank you all for listening. There are of course more practice questions as well as passage-based questions in our QBank, and see you for the next video.